Verses 9 and 10 tell us to remember the character of your Father. Verse 9 and 10 says this: "Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and lived? For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but He disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness." The theologian J.I. Packer says this: "The sum of the whole of the New Testament religion, if you describe it, you can sum up the whole New Testament religion if you describe it as knowledge of God as one's Holy Father. If you want to judge how well a person understands Christianity, find out how much they make of the thought of being God's child and having God as His Father. If this is not the thought that prompts and controls his worship and prayers, his whole outlook on life, then it means that he does not understand Christianity at all." So J.I. Packer says that knowledge of God as your Holy Father, he says that's a summary of the New Testament. You can agree with that or disagree with that. It's maybe a good thing to discuss afterwards if you'd say there's more or less to the New Testament than that. But he says what matters most is understanding that God is your Holy Father. And as I said, and I'm coming back to it, this can be difficult for some of us who've had unholy fathers in our lives. Because of abuse or neglect or absenteeism, we can just think, well, what does it even mean to have God as Father? Now, I want to point out in verse 9 to 10, it says that we're able to compare and contrast our experience with who God is. And I want to point out, it's mostly contrast. You see words there like much more or but or this kind of language. So the author says here that you should think about the experience of discipline from a father that you've experienced, but then think much more of the greater discipline of a greater father. And so I'm going to talk about, I guess, 3 bad parenting techniques. When God disciplines us, He does not fall into the bad fathering technique or the sin of anger. When God disciplines us, He doesn't do it as some parents label their discipline, which is just abuse or motivation by cruelty or anger. God, rather than being motivated by rage or reaction or whatever, He's motivated by compassion, wisdom, and love. He's the perfect Father. As we sang, He has a strength like no other and the heart of a father. I love it. So we see that there's this, it's not abuse, it's not anger when we experience the discipline of God. Another form of, I guess, substandard or bad parenting is the neglectful parents. There's some parents that are neglectful not by abusing, not by doing negative things, but by doing nothing. Some parents ignore their children or they abandon them. God never leaves us to figure things out on our own. God doesn't, He did not create the universe and then just walk away from it and say, okay, figure things out from there. And likewise, God doesn't create a spiritual son and then walk away and say, okay, now figure out life on your own. He is ever involved, not negligent. And then thirdly, He's not an overprotective parent. He allows His sons to go through hard times. Some parents want to protect their kids from anything and everything. I've heard the phrase helicopter parent. The parents always kind of hovering around, making sure that nothing bad happens, or almost wanting to, wrap their kids in cotton wool to protect them from anything bad ever happening. Keep them from experiencing pain, and then also keep them from experiencing negative consequences for their actions. And God's not like that. The verses above this show that they can measure the love that a parent has, not by the amount of pain that they can protect their children from, but how they will use the pain that they go through and how they can shape that for their maturity. Now, I know we're not really looking at the life of David so much today, but remember when David was younger and looking after his dad's sheep, like he had this terrible day one day when who should come but a lion? A lion prowls into the sheepfold, and David has to quickly make a decision, and he has to go, and it says he grabs the lion, and he kills the lion. And he thinks, whoa, what a day. And then the next day, I don't know, or maybe it's a week later, maybe it's a month later, but then we see that there's a bear that comes to the sheepfold. And David has to risk his life once again to protect his father's sheep. And maybe after that second occasion, can you imagine David praying? He puts down his pen. He's not writing a psalm that night. He's just saying, God, I thought you loved me. Why are you allowing not just one bad thing to take place, but secondly, it happens again and again. I could have died. It was terrible. Why did you let this happen to me? But then we do know later on in David's life, he's not going to be in his father's sheep pen, but he's going to be stepping into the valley of Elah in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. He has a giant called Goliath in front of him. He has the quivering, quiet, scared Israelite army behind him. And he says in verse 37, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the bear and the paw of the lion will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." So he goes through an incredible, trying, dangerous, scary time, and then finds out later on that that's part of God's disciplining, maturing process to turn David into the sort of young man that's able to deliver the Israelites from the Philistine army.